Hello, my name is Sarah, and I never thought I'd have to explain to my 13-year-old son why the one thing his grandfather gave him, the one thing he treasured, was suddenly gone. My own mother sold his antique watch, not because she needed to, not because it was an emergency. She sold it for $187,000 and used the money to give my sister's child a luxury life. When I asked my father how he could let that happen, he didn't argue. He didn't even look at me. He just said the watch was worthless. But when Grandpa found out, he didn't raise his voice. He smiled and said one sentence that made my parents turn pale. Before we go any further, tell me, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it for you? Because what I'm about to share isn't just a story about money. It's about who a family decides matters, and what it costs when you finally refuse to stay silent. I pulled into my parents' driveway the way I always had, slow and familiar, like my body knew the route even if my mind was elsewhere. The house looked the same pale siding, same oak tree dropping early leaves across the lawn. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken. And yet, the quiet felt heavier than usual, as if the place was holding its breath. My son, Evan, climbed out of the car before I'd even shut off the engine. 13 years old and already taller than I liked to admit, he had that restless energy kids get when they're excited, but trying not to show it. He slung his backpack over one shoulder and said, "I'm gonna grab it first, okay?" I nodded. "Sure, just don't run." He didn't run, but he walked fast, cutting through the front door like he'd done it 100 times before. This house had always been part of his map: Sunday dinners, holiday noise, and lately, Grandpa's quiet presence before he moved into assisted living the week before. The routines were still here, but something in them felt hollow now. Inside, the air was still. No television murmuring in the background. No radio from the kitchen. My mother's shoes were lined up neatly by the door, which meant she was home. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have. Evan hovered near the hallway, waiting for me. "You coming?" "In a second," I said, setting my purse down. I told myself I was imagining the tension, that it was just one of those days when things felt off for no reason. Life does that sometimes. We went to the den, the room my parents always called Grandpa's, even though it had belonged to all of us in different ways over the years. The furniture hadn't moved. The old desk sat by the window, the drawers worn smooth from decades of use. That's where the watch was kept. Always there, always safe. The watch wasn't flashy, no diamonds, no modern shine. It was heavy though, solid. Grandpa had given it to Evan on his 12th birthday, pressed into his palm with a quiet smile and a story about how his own father wore it to work every day, no matter the job. It wasn't about money, it was about continuity, about being trusted with something that had already lived a full life. We kept it here because my parents' house was steady, locked, predictable. Because I believed respect still meant something inside these walls. I opened the top drawer without thinking. The wooden box was exactly where it had always been, tucked in the back corner, same faint scratch across the lid, same smell of old paper and polish. I lifted the lid, nothing. For a moment, my brain refused to catch up. I stared, waiting for my eyes to adjust, as if the watch might appear if I just gave it time. The box was empty, clean, too clean. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. My hands stayed on the edge of the drawer, fingers numb, like they'd forgotten their job. Evan noticed me before he noticed the box. "Mom?" His voice was careful. He stepped closer, peering past me. Where is it?" I closed the drawer gently, the way you might shut a door on a bad smell. "Hang on," I said. My voice sounded steady, which surprised me. Inside, everything had gone still. We walked into the kitchen together. My mother stood by the counter, wiping down a surface that was already clean. She glanced up and smiled, the kind of smile meant to signal normalcy. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked Evan. I answered instead. "Where's the watch?" She didn't pause, didn't look confused. "Oh, that." That word landed wrong. She waved a hand like brushing away crumbs. "It's taken care of. You don't need to worry about it." "Taken care of how?" I asked. She shrugged, reaching for her mug. "It was just sitting there, not really being used." The room felt smaller. I could hear Evan's breathing beside me, shallow and quick. "It belonged to Evan," I said slowly. "Grandpa gave it to him." My mother took a sip of coffee. "He's a kid. He doesn't need something like that right now." Something in her tone told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mix-up or a temporary decision. This was final. I looked at Evan. He was staring at the floor, jaw tight, trying to be polite the way he'd been taught, trying not to ask the question forming in his throat. My mother kept talking, explaining without really explaining, her words floating past me. All I could see was that empty box in the drawer, waiting for something that wasn't coming back. I blinked, realizing I hadn't heard a word she'd said. My mother was still moving her mouth, her voice even and smooth, like someone reading from a script. But whatever story she was spinning couldn't touch the sound that had replaced everything in my head. Silence. Cold, pulsing silence. Evan stood a few feet behind me, arms folded like he was trying to take up less space. I turned slightly and gave him a small nod, as if to say, "Everything's okay," even though I didn't believe it for a second. He nodded back, too trusting. I told myself, don't make a scene, not in front of him, not again. So I sat down, at the table. Same chair I'd sat in growing up, with the little scratch on the back from when I tried to sneak a cookie and lost my balance. That kind of memory should have brought comfort. It didn't. "Can you just tell me what happened?" I said. I meant for my voice to come out calm. It landed flat. My mother dried her hands on a towel, folded it, and placed it on the counter like we were discussing laundry, not betrayal. "Well," she said, "I didn't think you'd react like this." "React like what?" I kept my face still. Let her talk. She reached for the chair across from me and sat. "Your father and we talked about it, and we agreed it was just sitting there, gathering dust." My pulse thumped in my neck. I looked at the window over the sink. The glass had smudges, probably Evan's, little handprints left behind from a time he didn't care what people thought. I turned back. "So, where is it?" Her mouth twitched, but she didn't flinch. "I sold it." I thought maybe I'd misheard her, or maybe she'd meant something else. Gave it away, donated it, anything but sold. "For how much?" I asked before I could stop myself. $400. I stared at her. "That's it?" She shrugged. It wasn't worth more. That number lodged itself in my throat like a splinter. $400. For a piece of history, for trust, for something Grandpa gave him, not you. "And you didn't think to call me?" "I didn't think it mattered," she said, her tone annoyingly calm. "It's not like it was going to get worn. Evan's a kid." I should have stood up. I should have said something sharp, something cutting. But instead, I just sat there, nodding slowly, like my body was stuck in molasses. "What did you do with the money?" I asked. That finally got a reaction. Her face lit up, just slightly, like she'd been waiting to justify herself. "I gave it to Melanie, for Addie's dance program." Of course. I could feel the floor under me shift. Not because of what she said, but because of how easy it was for her to say it. "It's expensive, and they've been cutting back at her school. Melanie said they weren't sure how they were going to cover everything. And I just thought, why let it sit in a drawer when it could actually do some good?" There it was, the justification, the logic, the math of it. Except I wasn't in the equation. Neither was Evan. "You could have told me," I said, quieter now. "I didn't think you'd understand," she said. No, what she meant was, you wouldn't agree. And she was right. She looked at me like she'd just explained a recipe, like I was supposed to smile and say thank you for the casserole. "He wouldn't have wanted it just sitting there," she added. My hands curled into themselves in my lap. Then, from the living room, a voice broke the quiet. "He didn't say that." I hadn't even realized my father was sitting there, tucked in his recliner like he'd become part of the furniture. He hadn't said a word the entire visit. Not when we arrived, not when I asked about the watch, not during the conversation that had cracked something in me. Now he spoke, one sentence, no anger, no hesitation. He didn't say that because it wasn't worth anything. The words dropped like stones in a pond. No splash, just sinking straight to the bottom. I didn't look at him, couldn't. My mother didn't react. She just stood up, poured herself another cup of decaf, and walked out of the kitchen like we'd finished discussing the weather. I sat very still. I couldn't feel my fingers, or my lips, or my heart. That was the moment everything inside me went quiet. Not peaceful, just blank. I thought, he wasn't talking about the watch. The sound of Evan shifting behind me brought me back. He was still standing by the wall, watching us, too old to be fooled, but too young to process what he'd just heard. He stepped forward cautiously, like he didn't want to break something already cracked. "Mom?" he asked. I turned to him. "Why'd they do that?" he said. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He didn't ask again. He didn't cry. He just stood there, trying to make sense of a world that had just tilted on its side, and I hated that I didn't have an answer that would protect him. Not a real one. I swallowed, finally managing. Some people think things don't matter unless they're useful. He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he understood more than he should have. We didn't stay much longer. On the way out, my father didn't say goodbye. My mother kissed Evan on the cheek, like everything was fine, said something about coming over for dinner next week. Evan didn't answer. He just walked to the car and got in. I followed, gripping my keys tighter than I needed to. And as I backed out of the driveway, my eyes stayed on the porch, where my father stood in the doorway, sipping his coffee. When he said worthless, I realized he wasn't talking about the watch. The sky was already turning navy as I turned left onto the main road, the kind of blue that makes the world feel too quiet. Jacob sat beside me in the passenger seat, legs pulled up, arms wrapped around his knees. He didn't say anything. I didn't either. No music, just the faint hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional click of the turn signal. I glanced at him a couple of times, hoping maybe he'd say something first. But his face was tilted toward the window, unreadable in the dimming light. I kept my hands on the steering wheel, at 10 and 2 like I'd taught him when he first asked about driving. That felt like a lifetime ago. Maybe it was. Driving back from family dinners had always felt like this ache of something unsaid sitting between us. It wasn't new. I just hadn't admitted it until now. The road stretched ahead, familiar and silent. Each streetlight we passed flickered through the windshield like slow blinks. It gave me time to think, too much time. And somehow, in that quiet, something opened up. A memory, not loud or sharp, but persistent. The kind that's been waiting for years for a quiet enough moment to return. I was maybe 7, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of orange juice. I'd wanted to tell Mom something, I can't even remember what now, but she was on the phone, pacing, distracted. Dad was reading the paper. I waited, then waited some more. Eventually, I just folded my hands and told myself it probably wasn't that important. I remember the way the orange juice tasted that day, just a little off, like it had been open too long. I learned early that the way to be loved in my family was to be easy. not needy, not loud, not the one who needed comforting. I was the strong one. That phrase had been handed to me like a medal and a muzzle all at once. Mom used to say it as if it were praise. "You're just like me," she'd tell me, smiling. "You don't let things get to you." But they did. I just didn't show it. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the porch light was already on. The front yard looked exactly the same as we'd left it 2 hours ago, but something about it felt different. Like the weight in the car had reshaped the world outside of it. Jacob unbuckled his seatbelt slowly. I waited, not sure if I should say something, ask him how he was doing, or pretend things were normal. He opened the front door and disappeared inside without a word. I followed, locking the car behind me. The house was still and dim. I didn't turn on the overhead light, just let the glow from the kitchen spill into the hallway. I could hear him upstairs, shuffling around his room. I set my bag down and leaned against the counter. My hands were cold. I rubbed them together and tried to breathe like I wasn't unraveling. Then I heard his voice, soft but clear. "Mom." Was it really that important? He was standing halfway down the stairs, looking at me like he wanted the truth, but was scared of it too. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out right away. He wasn't just asking about the watch. He was asking about what it meant, why no one thought he'd care, why it could be taken and sold and written off without even a conversation. I walked toward him slowly. "It mattered to us," I said gently. "That should have been enough." He nodded, but I saw it. The way his lips pressed together too tightly, the way his shoulders stiffened like he was holding something in. "I mean, it's okay," he added quickly. "I get it. It's just a thing." That hit harder than anything else tonight, because I'd said those exact words before. I'd said them when they gave my sister the bigger room, when they forgot to show up for my school play, when they left me out of those little inside jokes that families are supposed to share. "It's fine, I get it. I don't need much." I'd meant it, or at least I'd wanted to mean it. Seeing Jacob say the same thing, in the same voice, with the same little shrug, it broke something open. I sat on the bottom step beside him. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't matter." He looked at me, startled. "I'm not pretending." "You are, and it's okay. I used to do it too. But it's not okay to stay quiet just because people expect you to." He looked away. "I don't want to make things worse." Neither did I, and that was the problem. That impulse, to smooth things over, to not rock the boat, it had been branded into me so deeply I could barely separate it from who I was. I'd swallowed more hurt than I could count, all under the name of keeping peace. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, picking up my phone. I stared at it for a long time. I thought about calling Mom, not to argue, just to smooth things out, reframe it, make it easier. But Jacob was still sitting there on the steps, quiet and small, and watching me with those eyes that had already learned to brace for disappointment. And I realized, if I stayed silent now, what exactly was I teaching my son to become? Jacob eventually climbed the rest of the stairs and went to his room without another word. I stood there for a while, phone still in hand, staring at nothing in particular. Something inside me had shifted. It wasn't rage or sadness, it was something tighter, quieter, like a wire pulled just short of snapping. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't cry. I didn't pour a glass of wine or scroll through messages hoping for a distraction. Instead, I washed the dinner plates we never used, wiped down a perfectly clean counter, and checked on Jacob once before heading to bed. He was already asleep, or pretending to be. I didn't ask which. The next morning, I woke before the sun. I don't usually do that. But that day, I needed the quiet before the noise. The house felt like it was holding its breath. I moved slowly through the kitchen, grounding myself in simple things: the click of the coffee maker, the smell of toast, the sound of the faucet turning off. Outside, the sky was still soft with morning gray. Birds chirped, cars hadn't started their rush yet. It wasn't peace, it was a pause. The kind before a decision turns into action. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and stared out the window at nothing in particular. My phone sat in front of me, screen dark but heavy with what needed to happen next. They thought I'd let it go. They always did. But this time felt different, not because I was angrier, but because I wasn't. I was clear. At 7:43 a.m., I picked up the phone and dialed my parents' house. The line rang only once. "Hello," Mom answered, chipper as ever. That forced brightness she wore like perfume, applied thick enough to hide the rot underneath. "Hi, Mom," I said. My voice was calm. Even I was surprised by how steady it sounded. "Do you have a moment?" "Oh, honey, of course," she replied. "Are you all right? You seemed a little sensitive yesterday." I closed my eyes. "I'm calling about the watch," I said. A beat of silence. "Oh," she said, her tone shifting. "That again?" "Yes, that again." "Well, I just don't see why this needs to become a whole thing. It was just sitting there for years. No one was using it. And your sister's been through so much lately. We thought it could help." There it was. We. I didn't ask who exactly we was, because I already knew. It didn't matter if it was just her or Dad or both. They were aligned in a way I never had been with either of them. "I'm not calling to argue," I said. "I'm calling because what happened wasn't okay. Not just the watch being sold, but how it was done. No conversation, no warning. No thought for Jacob and what that gift meant to him." "Oh, sweetheart," she sighed. "You're overthinking this. Kids are resilient. He'll forget all about it in a week." "No, he won't." "Well, if you just explain to him that it was for the greater good, for the family, he might understand. Someday." I gripped the phone tighter. "It's not his job to understand," I said. "It's your job not to make him feel disposable." She chuckled. "Don't be dramatic." I could hear Dad in the background, the muffled clink of a spoon in a mug. "I'm not being dramatic," I said. "I'm being direct. Something I probably should have learned to be a long time ago." She went quiet. "I need you to hear me," I continued. "This isn't going away. You may think it will, that I'll get over it, that we'll sweep it under the rug like always. But this time, I won't." The silence on her end thickened. I imagined her sitting at their kitchen table, that same smirk playing at her lips, thinking this was just one of my little emotional flare-ups that would burn out like a match. "This crossed a line," I said, "and if it happens again, or if you pretend this never happened, there will be consequences, real ones, for our relationship, for what Jacob sees, for what I allow in his life." Her voice came back, light and airy. "Well, that's unfortunate, but if that's how you feel, I guess there's nothing else to say." There it was, the wall, built from decades of rehearsed indifference. "I guess not," I said. She cleared her throat. "Well, I hope you have a good day. Let me know if Jacob wants to come by next weekend." She said it like none of this had happened, like I'd imagined all of it. "We'll see," I replied. "Okay, honey, take care." Click. I stared at the phone in my hand for a long while after the call ended. The sun had started pouring in through the window now, casting warm light across the table, but it didn't feel warm. It felt like a spotlight, like I'd finally stepped onto a stage I'd been avoiding my whole life. They thought I was bluffing. They hung up thinking this would pass, because it always had. They thought I'd cool off, settle down, get over it, like I always had. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, tense. Days passed without a word from them. No follow-up call, no apology, no acknowledgement. Just quiet, as if my boundary hadn't been spoken at all. The world around me moved on. Kids went to school, bills arrived, dishes piled up and got washed. But something inside me stayed stuck, like I was watching everyone else swim while I sank in place. At first, I tried to match their silence. I told myself I'd said my piece, that I couldn't force them to care, that maybe the strongest thing I could do was just step back. But the hurt didn't fade, it sharpened. 3 days after the phone call, I was waiting in the school parking lot to pick up Jacob. A group of moms stood nearby, chatting. Someone was complaining about how hard it was to get into the right music camp, how expensive the private options were. One laughed about her daughter having to settle for second-tier tutoring. I sat in my car, window cracked, their voices floating in. I looked down at my chipped steering wheel and thought of the watch again, not just what it meant emotionally, but what it could have done. A camp fee, a laptop, a step forward for Jacob. And it had been handed off like junk for parts. The unfairness didn't just sting, it burned. I didn't know how long I sat there after Jacob climbed in. We drove home quietly. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. But that night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every word I'd said to my parents. Was I too harsh? Too dramatic? Maybe they were right. Maybe I had let a watch, become too much. Maybe I was the problem. That's the thing about old wounds. They don't always bleed. Sometimes they whisper, and mine whispered the same thing it always had. Don't make a fuss. Keep the peace. Be grateful. Be quiet. I almost gave in to it. The next morning, Jacob left his breakfast half-eaten, said he wasn't hungry. I watched him zip his backpack and tug the straps a little tighter, like he needed something to hold him up. I didn't ask if he was okay. He didn't offer. At school pickup that afternoon, his teacher flagged me down. "Hey, just a heads up," she said gently. "Jacob's been a little withdrawn this week. Quiet, not his usual self." I nodded, thanked her, smiled the way you're supposed to. But the moment we got home, I followed him upstairs. He was lying on his bed, not reading or drawing like he normally would, just staring at the ceiling, same as I had the night before. I sat down beside him. "You all right?" I asked softly. He shrugged. "You want to talk about anything?" Another shrug. And then, without turning his head, he said, "I know you said it's just a watch, but it wasn't. Not to me." That's when it hit me. He hadn't been asking for the watch back. He'd been waiting to see if I would fight for what mattered, for him. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my phone. I almost called them, not to yell, not to argue, but to make it all go away, to keep the water calm, to let things return to normal. But the cost was too high. Still, I hovered, finger over the screen, telling myself maybe it was better to let it go. Maybe peace was worth more than pride. I almost convinced myself, until the next morning. I was checking my email, just sorting through the usual junk, when I saw a forwarded message from my cousin Erica. The subject line was vague, something like, "Thought you'd want to see." I clicked without thinking. It was a receipt, an invoice, from a local antique dealer. The description was unmistakable. 1940s railroad watch, engraved back, minor wear, sold for appraisal. And the date? It wasn't last week. It was 3 months ago, which meant everything they told me, the timing, the decision, the reason, had been a lie. Just as I was ready to let it go, I learned something they never meant me to know. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, coffee going cold beside me, and pulled up the receipt again. Erica hadn't sent any message with it, just the file. But the date was there, clear as daylight. That watch had been sold in April. It was now July. They'd lied not just about why, but when. This wasn't some last-minute, desperate decision. It had been premeditated, planned, and concealed. They watched me come over, hug them, bring Jacob around, all the while knowing what they'd done and choosing not to say a word. I opened a tab, checked the business listed on the invoice. Still active. I called, pretending to be the seller. The woman who answered was polite, professional. "Oh, yes, I remember that piece," she said. "Lovely condition, rare engraving. We were surprised the family let it go." Family. That word again. Used so easily. "How much did it sell for?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She hesitated. "I'm not sure I should disclose that. I'm the daughter. It was my grandfather's watch." A pause. Then, "Over 8,000. We had buyers waiting for it." I didn't say thank you. I just ended the call and stared at the number she'd given me, echoing louder in my head than any shout could have. 8,000. They said it was barely worth keeping. I printed everything, the receipt, the listing. I went back into my emails and pulled the thread where my mother had brushed off my questions. It wasn't anything valuable, she'd written. We only did what made sense for everyone. Everyone. Jacob certainly wasn't included in that word. 2 days later, I got in my car and drove to their house. I didn't bring Jacob. I didn't tell anyone I was going. The street looked the same. The flower pots still lined the porch. My dad's car sat in the driveway like nothing had ever shifted. I rang the bell and waited. My mother opened the door with her usual half smile, the kind she wore like makeup. "You're early," she said, like we'd planned this. "I need to talk." She stepped aside. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something baking. I walked into the living room and sat down. My father was already in his chair, TV muted, remote in hand. He didn't look at me. I pulled the receipt from my purse and set it on the coffee table. "This is from April," I said, 3 months before you told me it was sold. Neither of them moved. "This wasn't a last-minute thing. It wasn't even recent. You sold it, lied about it, and when I confronted you, you acted like I was making a scene." Still nothing. "I'm not here to argue," I continued. "I'm here to say this was a violation, not just of trust, of family, of memory, of Jacob's right to a legacy that belonged to him." My mother tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "You're blowing this out of proportion," she said softly, as if that would soften the blow. "No, I'm not," I replied, calm but firm. "You could have told me. You chose not to, and then you justified it by talking about sacrifice and family needs. But the truth is, you made a decision and expected I'd stay quiet, because I always have." My father finally looked up. "It was just a watch." "No," I said. "It was respect." They didn't apologize. Of course they didn't. Instead, my mother sighed. "You're making this ugly. We've done everything for this family." "You've done everything for parts of this family," I corrected. "And the part that wasn't included has a name. Jacob." Silence thickened. "I'm not asking for an apology anymore," I said as I stood. "I'm not asking for anything, but I'm letting you know there will be changes." "Are you threatening us?" my father asked, voice sharp now. "No, I'm drawing a line." And I left. Later that afternoon, I sat in my home office. The printed documents were still on my desk. I pulled up the email I'd been composing for days. Legal, respectful, factual. It wasn't about revenge, it was about process. I hit send. Then I made a second call, to my uncle, the family trustee. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand, I informed, I shared the documents. I told him what I'd learned and what steps I was taking to make sure decisions from now on included full transparency and accountability. He didn't argue. After the call, I closed my laptop, leaned back, and took the first deep breath I'd had in weeks. I knew it wasn't over. I knew retaliation would come. The disapproving messages, the subtle slander, the twisted retellings. But I wasn't bracing for it anymore. For the first time, I wasn't asking them to listen. I was making sure they had to. It started quietly. Too quiet, in fact. A few missed calls that didn't leave voicemails. A couple of text messages from distant cousins I hadn't heard from in years, all vague and strangely worded. By the third day, I knew. The first real sign came from Aunt Linda, who called under the guise of just checking in. She never just checked in. "I heard things have gotten tense," she said carefully. "But we're family, you know. We can't let misunderstandings pull us apart." I didn't respond right away. Let her sit in her discomfort. Then she added, "Your mom's been really hurt. She didn't expect you to, well, go this far." This far. That phrase struck a nerve, like I'd crossed some unspoken line by refusing to stay quiet. "What exactly did she say I did?" I asked. Linda gave a half laugh. "You know how stories get twisted. All I know is, people are saying you threatened to sue your own parents. Over a watch." And there it was. They'd moved fast, crafted a version of events, distributed it quietly, strategically. The watch was no longer about legacy or trust. It had been rebranded into a symbol of my ungratefulness. By the end of the week, 3 more relatives had reached out, all with the same tone, concerned, gently scolding, baffled. "She only ever wanted to help you. Is this really worth tearing the family apart? You know how your father is. He's old-fashioned. Let it go." Even friends who weren't part of the family started mentioning things they'd heard. It wasn't just internal now. They'd gone wide. My name, my character, my motivations, they were painting over everything with broad, convenient strokes. One afternoon, while making dinner, I got a text from my high school friend, Dana. Just 6 words. "Are you okay? I saw Facebook." I didn't even have the energy to check. I already knew what I'd find. The next blow came sharper. My father called. I answered on instinct. Habit dies slow. His voice was calm. Too calm. "I heard you've been talking," he said, "sharing things that should have stayed private." I didn't respond. He continued, "I understand emotions get the better of people sometimes, but you need to think about the consequences of your choices." It was all said in the same measured tone he'd always used when disciplining us as kids. Never yelling, never openly angry. Just deliberate, cold. "I'm not trying to fight," I said, "but I'm not going to pretend anymore." There was a long pause. "Then I suppose you've made your decision," he said. "Just remember, you can't unmake it." The line went dead. I sat on the edge of the couch afterward, staring at the floor, feeling the weight of generations press into my shoulders. Was this worth it? The isolation, the judgment, the subtle exile? Was I protecting something, or just tearing apart what little was left? That night, Jacob came into my room, holding a drawing he'd made. It was of our house, with the 2 of us in front of it. He'd written our names above our heads. Simple, innocent. He handed it to me and said, "I made sure it looked like us. Even your necklace." It was the necklace my grandfather had given me before he passed. One of the few things I'd kept. My parents hadn't touched it. Maybe they thought it wasn't valuable enough to sell. I ran my thumb over the little paper version of myself. That tiny drawing reminded me what this had always been about. Not revenge, not rebellion, legacy, memory, truth. I looked at Jacob, already learning how family can shift beneath your feet, how people can smile and still erase you. If I stepped back now, what would I be teaching him? That silence was safer than truth? That lies wrapped in family slogans were worth more than honesty? No, not anymore. I tucked the drawing into my journal and stood up. My spine felt straighter. They wanted to control the story, but I wasn't giving them the last word. If they wanted a war of stories, I was done letting them write mine. I didn't sleep much the night before. It wasn't anxiety exactly, it was something quieter, like being right before the end of a long, awful movie and knowing you've watched enough to understand where it's going. The meeting was set for late morning, a neutral space. Not their house, not mine. A small office downtown that belonged to a friend of a friend, someone who owed me a favor and didn't ask questions. Clean walls, quiet hall, no family photos, no memories. I arrived 10 minutes early, but they were already there. My father stood when I walked in, but it wasn't out of respect. It was his old habit, always controlling the room by rising first. My mother gave a tight-lipped smile, like we were about to discuss a menu, not a lie. I nodded to both and sat. Didn't offer small talk, didn't ask how they were. I just looked at them and let the silence stretch. They were still sure of themselves, still certain I'd come crawling back, regretful, softened, desperate to make peace. Instead, I waited. When the third party, a mediator of sorts, a retired family friend who volunteered to keep the peace, cleared her throat and asked why we were here, I let them speak first. And they did. My father opened with calm certainty, outlining how this unfortunate situation had gotten blown out of proportion. My mother chimed in about misunderstandings and hurt feelings. They both emphasized how family matters shouldn't be handled through outsiders or legal routes, that I had overreacted, that the watch was just a thing, and what mattered was unity. I didn't say a word, just kept eye contact. Let them bury themselves deeper. When they were done, I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. I didn't slam it down, I didn't throw it. I just opened it calmly and began laying things out. First, the receipts. Dated, verified. A digital log of the sale. The timing was clear. It happened before the family decision they claimed to have made. Next, emails, short exchanges between my father and a private collector, discussing price, negotiating terms, clear mentions that she doesn't know yet. The mediator leaned in, reading. My mother went pale. I turned the last page, a notarized statement from the lawyer who'd overseen my grandfather's estate. It clarified that the watch had been specifically left in trust for Jacob, the child of my granddaughter, and not to be sold. Silence, heavy, cracking. My father looked at me, jaw tight. This isn't what it looks like. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to explain. Then, from behind me, came the sound of a cane tapping the floor. Grandpa, he'd asked to come quietly. He hadn't said if he'd speak. But now he stepped into the room and looked at them, not angrily, not accusingly, just tired. That watch, he said softly, wasn't about value. It was about memory, about responsibility, and it was never yours to give away. My mother looked like she'd been slapped. My father sat very still. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. He just stood there, a man who'd trusted the wrong people with something sacred. "I'm not angry," he said finally, "but I am disappointed, deeply." He turned to me and nodded once. Then he left. No drama, no exit line. I let the silence breathe again. And then I stood, walked to the door, and paused. "Oh," I said, reaching into my coat pocket. "One more thing." I opened the door and Jacob stepped in. He looked unsure for a second, then walked toward me. On his wrist, the watch. It wasn't flashy, it didn't sparkle, but in that moment it carried weight no dollar figure could touch. I didn't explain, I didn't need to. I watched my father's eyes catch on it, and for the first time his expression broke. Not rage, not even shame, just confusion, like he'd finally realized the ground had shifted and didn't know where to step. My mother's mouth parted, but no words came. Jacob turned and followed me back out the door. There were no goodbyes, just air, lighter than it had been in years. They finally understood the truth, but understanding doesn't undo what's been broken. For weeks, it was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles after a storm's moved through and you're standing in the stillness, not sure yet what's been destroyed. No calls came, no emails. The group threads stopped pinging. Even the guilt-laced forwarded memes my mother used to send by accident dried up. It was as if the family had collectively agreed. If they didn't acknowledge it, maybe it didn't happen. But it had, and I wasn't pretending anymore. I spent the first few days after that final meeting going through normal life, packing school lunches, replying to work messages, folding laundry that never seemed to end. But everything felt different, not heavier, just honest. The weight was still there. I had just stopped carrying it for them. The legal side moved faster than I expected. A few formal documents, a quiet correction to the trust handling, and one very polite email from their financial advisor to mine. There was no lawsuit, no courtroom drama, no explosive reckoning with strangers watching, just paperwork and consequences. They didn't make a public scene, my parents. Of course they didn't. That would have required admitting something had happened. Instead, they pulled back. Phone conversations became stilted, scripted. Holiday invites didn't arrive. Jacob's birthday passed with a single mailed card that had no signature, only "from us" typed neatly inside. It was cowardly and familiar. When my father finally reached out, it was under the guise of checking in, just making sure you're doing okay with everything that's been stirred up. He said it like he was the victim, like I'd created a mess, and he was graciously overlooking it. "I still think this could have been handled within the family," he said, near the end of that brief call. "You know, without outsiders getting involved." I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just said, "I heard you," and let the silence fall on him this time. That was our last conversation. I haven't seen my mother in person since the day of the meeting. She sent a short text once, something about hoping everyone is healing in their own time. I didn't reply. She never followed up. That told me everything I needed to know. Their silence wasn't peace. It was shame wrapped in pride, and I no longer felt the need to fix it. One afternoon, Jacob and I were sitting on the porch. It was early spring, cool enough for a light jacket. He was sketching something in a notebook, nothing special, just lines and shapes. I brought him a glass of water, sat beside him, and noticed the watch on his wrist. He wasn't fiddling with it. He wasn't showing it off. It was just there. Part of his life now, the way it was always supposed to be. I watched him tap it lightly once, checking the time before flipping the page in his sketchbook, like it had always belonged. And in that quiet moment, it no longer felt like a win or a battle. It felt like balance. A few days later, I visited Grandpa. He'd moved into a smaller place recently, somewhere quieter and easier to manage. He opened the door with that same gentle look, equal parts tired and kind. We didn't talk about the meeting, or the fallout, or the silence. We just sat. He made coffee. We listened to the birds outside the window. At one point, I thanked him, not just for stepping in, but for trusting me when so few had. He nodded, gave a small smile, and said, "You did right, that's enough." It was. On the drive home, I thought about everything that had changed, and everything that hadn't. The damage didn't magically disappear. Some bridges burned don't rebuild, but others don't need to. I didn't get my parents back, but I got myself back. And more importantly, Jacob never had to wonder if his worth was up for negotiation. I didn't teach my son how to fight. I taught him that he was never worthless to begin with.